The sun hung low over the ancient lands, casting long shadows across the stone paths and painting the horizon in deep, burning gold. Dust, kicked up by thousands of feet, turned the air into a hazy, shimmering veil. In the heart of the marketplace, the noise was constant. The clatter of wooden carts, the haggling of merchants, the heavy rhythm of daily survival. Then, the cadence of the crowd shifted. It did not happen all at once. It started as a ripple, a sudden stillness in the middle of the chaos. A figure moved through the narrow lanes, walking with a steady, unhurried pace. He carried no banner, no weapon, and no gold. Yet, as he passed, the weary stopped their work. Those bent under the weight of heavy loads straightened their backs. Men and women who had spent their lives staring at the ground lifted their heads to watch him. There was no sound of trumpets, only the growing silence of a multitude turning their attention toward one point. People began to leave their stalls, stepping out from the shadows of the alleyways to follow in his wake. The air felt charged, heavy with the weight of unvoiced questions. Away from the main path, the world narrowed to a single fixed point. A man sat on the hard, packed earth, his back pressed against the rough stone of a roadside wall. For him, the golden light of the sunset did not exist. There was only the heat radiating from the rock and the grit of the dust settling on his skin. He heard the world in fragments, the rhythmic thud of sandals on stone, the distant clatter of trade, the low murmur of voices that never stopped to acknowledge his presence. He had sat here for years. His hands, calloused and steady, rested on his knees, feeling the vibration of every passerby. He knew the difference between the heavy tread of a merchant and the hurried step of a laborer. He knew the smell of incoming rain and the sharp, dry scent of the desert wind. But these were the limits of his existence. He lived in a cycle of unchanging hours, a landscape defined by the reach of his own arms. The future offered no variations. It was a long, unbroken line of darkness, a path he walked in his mind every day, leading nowhere. He tilted his head, listening. The silence he had braced for never arrived. Instead, the air grew tight, vibrating with a new, frantic energy. The steady, rhythmic thud of sandals on the road accelerated into a chaotic, overlapping scramble. Voices that had been low and indifferent now rose in pitch, blending into a singular, rushing tide of sound. It was as if the very ground beneath him had begun to tilt. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the rough stone of the wall until his knuckles ached. The noise was no longer a dull hum of commerce. It was a wave of movement, a surge of bodies pressing past him with an urgency he had never felt before. He heard the sudden, sharp intake of breath from those nearby, the frantic scuffling of feet as people broke into a run. Then, the name cut through the clamor, sharp and distinct, repeated by a dozen throats at once. Jesus is coming. He pushed himself upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, every nerve tuned to the approaching footsteps. He lunged forward, his hands grasping at the air, searching for the edge of the road. The crowd surged past him, a wall of shifting bodies and hurried breath. He stumbled, his shoulder striking a passerby who shoved him back into the dust. He did not retreat. He planted his feet, drew a sharp, ragged breath, and opened his mouth. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. The words tore from his throat, raw and jagged. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd turned into sharp, stinging rebukes. Be quiet, someone hissed, a hand pressing firmly against his chest to force him down. He felt the weight of their disapproval, the cold pressure of their hands trying to dim his resolve. He ignored the sting of the dust on his skin and the rough shove that sent him reeling. He pushed back, his lungs burning, his voice rising above the chaotic shuffle of sandals and the impatient chatter of the throng. Son of David, have mercy, he shouted, until the air around him seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of his desperation. His plea carving a path through the noise. The shouting stopped. The air grew heavy, static, as if the world had held its breath. Footsteps ceased. A hand, firm and steady, gripped his shoulder and guided him forward through the sudden, unnatural hush. He stumbled over uneven ground, his heart drumming against his ribs. Then, the hand released him. He stood alone in the center of the silence. A voice, calm and resonant, spoke from just ahead. "What do you want me to do for you?" The question hung in the air, simple and demanding. He did not hesitate. "Lord, I want to see." He felt a presence close by, a warmth that seemed to radiate through the space between them. "Go," the voice said. "Your faith has made you well." In that heartbeat, the darkness that had defined his existence for a lifetime shattered. It did not fade. It exploded. A violent, blinding rush of light flooded his vision, forcing him to squeeze his eyes shut against the sudden, searing intensity. He gasped, his knees buckling as his brain struggled to process the onslaught of form and color. He forced his eyelids open. The world rushed in. The air in the courtyard of Cana was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the rhythmic pulse of music. Laughter rose in waves, clashing against the stone walls, as guests moved in, tight, swirling groups. Wine flowed freely, staining the wooden tables and fueling the boisterous energy of the night. Then, the rhythm faltered. A servant hurried to a large stone jar, tipped it, and felt nothing but the hollow thud of air. He shook it, tilted it further, and stared into the dark, empty interior. The music continued, but the servant's face paled. He signaled to another, who checked the remaining vessels. One by one, they were tilted, drained, and abandoned. The realization rippled through the staff, a silent, frantic communication of failure. The head of the banquet house approached, his brow furrowed as he reached for a cup, only to find the pitcher light and dry. He looked at the empty jars, then at the guests, his expression hardening into a mask of sudden, cold dread. The laughter that had filled the space now sounded sharp and brittle. A low murmur of confusion began to spread among the tables as the flow of the feast ground to a halt. The hosts exchanged frantic, wide-eyed glances, the weight of a profound social disgrace settling over them like a shroud. Mary moved through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the center of the gathering. She reached the side of the Nazarene and spoke, her voice low and urgent, carrying the weight of the host's impending ruin. Jesus turned, his gaze steady, acknowledging the crisis that threatened to shatter the night. He did not look toward the empty vessels or the panicked guests, but directly at the servants, standing nearby, idle and trembling. "Fill the jars with water," he commanded. The instruction cut through the murmurs of the room. The servants froze, glancing at one another, their expressions caught between confusion and obedience. The jars were meant for purification, not for the feast. Yet, the authority in his voice left no room for debate. They moved toward the stone basins, their footsteps heavy on the floor. They lifted heavy clay pitchers, walked to the well, and returned, pouring stream after stream of clear, cold water into the 6 massive stone containers. The sound of splashing liquid echoed in the sudden quiet, a rhythmic, hollow cadence that filled the room. They worked with frantic precision. The servants stood motionless, their hands gripping the heavy pitchers as the surface of the water in the stone jars shimmered. "Now draw some out," the command came, soft but carrying across the hushed room. They dipped their vessels into the basins, expecting the clear, thin splash of water. Instead, a deep, rich crimson swirled into their cups, catching the golden light of the torches. A heady, complex aroma rose from the liquid, sharp and sweet, filling the air with the scent of crushed grapes and aged wood. The servants exchanged wide-eyed, silent glances, their breath hitching in their chests. They carried the pitchers to the master of the banquet, who stood waiting with a grim expression, his hand already reaching out to address the shortage. He took the cup, his fingers brushing the cool clay, and lifted it to his lips. He paused, His brow furrowed as the scent reached him. He took a long, slow sip. His eyes widened, his posture shifting from rigid anxiety to utter disbelief. He turned to the host, the cup trembling in his grip. "Everyone brings the choice wine first," he whispered. "But you have saved the best until now." The hosts stood frozen, staring at the jars, the impossible reality of the moment settling over the room like a warm, golden light. The echoes of the celebration in Cana faded into the cooling air of the evening. Jesus turned from the festive halls, his steps leading toward the distant, dark expanse of the Sea of Galilee. The disciples followed, their pace steady, leaving the warmth of the torches behind for the salt-heavy breeze of the coast. They reached the shoreline, where their small wooden vessel bobbed in the shallows. The water was a mirror, reflecting the first stars that pierced the darkening sky. There was no wind. The surface did not ripple. It lay flat and heavy, like polished obsidian. They waded into the shallows, the cold water swirling around their ankles as they gripped the gunwales. With a collective push, the boat slid free from the sand, floating into the deep. The disciples moved with practiced efficiency, unfurling the canvas sails that hung limp in the stagnant air. They took their places, hands resting on the oars, waiting for the signal to row. Jesus stepped into the stern and sat, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the water met the void. Everything was still. They pulled the first stroke, the oars slicing through the glass-like surface. The shift was not gradual. A sudden, cold gust slammed into the sails, snapping the wooden mast with a sound like a gunshot. The mirror-like surface of the sea shattered into jagged, white-capped peaks that rose and fell with terrifying speed. The boat groaned, its timbers straining against the onslaught of water. Waves crashed over the gunwales, flooding the deck and soaking the disciples to the bone. They scrambled to secure the ropes, their hands slipping on the wet, salt-slicked wood as the vessel pitched violently. The wind roared, a deafening howl that swallowed their shouts and turned the night into a swirling vortex of spray and darkness. Every time the boat crested a wave, it hung suspended for a heartbeat before plunging into the trough, the impact jarring their teeth. Panic took hold. They braced themselves against the mast, eyes wide, searching for a way to steady the craft. Yet, in the stern, amidst the chaos of water and wind, Jesus lay undisturbed. His head rested against a coil of rope, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He remained a silent anchor in the center of the tempest, completely unaware of the water swirling around his feet. A massive wave slammed into the side, sending the boat into a sickening tilt. The disciples could hold on no longer. They lunged toward the stern, grabbing at the air, their voices raw with terror. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" They shook him, their hands trembling against the wood. Jesus opened his eyes. He did not look at the water. He did not look at the wind. He looked at them. He stood up, steadying himself against the violent pitch of the deck, as if the floor were solid stone. He stepped to the edge of the boat, his hand extended into the spray. He spoke, and the sound cut through the roar of the gale with absolute, piercing clarity. "Peace! Be still!" The effect was instantaneous. The wind did not fade. It vanished. The waves did not subside. They froze. The roar of the tempest was replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. The water, a second ago a churning wall of death, flattened into a sheet of black glass. The disciples stood paralyzed, their breath hitching in their chests, staring at the water, then at the man standing before them. The storm had ceased to exist. The boat touched the shore, but there was no solitude to be found. Thousands had tracked the movement of the vessel along the coastline, waiting in the heat of the afternoon sun. They stood in clusters across the dry, cracked earth, a sea of people stretching toward the horizon. Jesus climbed from the boat and walked among them, his presence drawing the crowd into a singular, focused mass. Hours passed. The sun began its slow descent, casting long, jagged shadows across the plain. The air grew cooler, but the atmosphere shifted. The restless energy of the crowd changed into the quiet, gnawing pressure of hunger. The disciples moved through the throng, their faces tight with concern as they observed the sheer volume of people. They stopped at the edge of the gathering, looking out over the thousands. There were no markets nearby, no supply lines, no way to procure food for such a multitude. The reality of the situation settled in. They were miles from any village, and the sun was dipping below the tree line. The disciples turned to Jesus, their voices hushed by the weight of the problem. They had nothing to offer, no plan to execute, and the hunger of the crowd was becoming an undeniable physical force that threatened to break the order of the day. The disciples fanned out, moving through the dense rows of people. They asked, they searched, they looked for any sign of provisions. The result was always the same: empty hands and hollow stares. The hunger was no longer a distant concern. It was a physical weight pressing against the crowd. Then, a small boy stepped forward. He held a woven basket, his grip tight against the rough fibers. Inside lay 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. It was a lunch for 1, perhaps 2, but certainly not for the thousands gathered on the plain. One of the disciples took the basket, his fingers brushing the dry, hard crust of the bread. He held it up, turning it over in the fading light. He looked at the boy, then at the vast, undulating sea of people, then back at the basket. The math was impossible. The logic was broken. He walked back to Jesus, the basket feeling heavy with the weight of its own inadequacy. He stopped a few paces away, his shoulders slumped. He gestured to the crowd, then to the meager offering, his expression one of weary resignation. He held the basket out, waiting for the inevitable command. Jesus took the basket. He did not look at the crowd or the disciples. He looked upward, his face steady in the fading light. He gave thanks. The words were simple, clear, and carried across the silence that had suddenly fallen over the immediate circle. Then, he began to break the bread. The crust snapped, dry and firm, but as he pulled the pieces apart, the loaf did not diminish. It grew. He handed a portion to a disciple, then another, and another. The movement became a rhythm. The disciples moved through the rows of people, their arms heavy with bread and fish that seemed to replenish themselves with every step. The skepticism on their faces vanished, replaced by a frantic, focused energy. They walked, they reached, they distributed. Thousands of hands reached out. The sound of chewing replaced the low murmur of hunger. People ate until they could eat no more. The plain was no longer a place of want. It was a place of overflowing provision. When the last person had finished, Jesus gestured to the ground. The disciples walked back through the rows, gathering what remained. They filled 12 baskets, brimming with the surplus. The night air turned cold and thick. The disciples pushed the boat away from the shore, but the wind shifted almost immediately. It came in sharp, unpredictable gusts that caught the sail and forced the bow down into the dark water. They grabbed the oars, their knuckles white against the wood, pulling with everything they had. The boat groaned under the strain of the waves. Every stroke was a battle against the current. They were exhausted, their muscles burning, yet the boat barely moved forward. The spray hit their faces, stinging and relentless. Then, the wind seemed to hold its breath. Through the gloom, a shape emerged. It did not bob with the waves. It moved across them, steady and deliberate. It was a man, walking on the surface of the sea. The disciples stopped rowing. The oars clattered against the side of the boat. They stared, their breathing ragged and shallow. Panic surged through the boat. "It is a ghost!" he shouted. The others scrambled back, their eyes wide with terror as the figure continued to approach. The figure stopped. A voice cut through the roar of the wind, steady and calm. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." The disciples froze, the terror in their chests replaced by a sudden, sharp silence. Peter stood up, his eyes locked on the figure. He did not ask for proof. He asked for a path. "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." The command came back, simple and direct. "Come." Peter did not hesitate. He swung his legs over the side of the boat. He placed his weight onto the surface of the sea. The water held. It felt firm, like solid ground under his boots. He took a step, then another, moving toward the figure. The wind howled, whipping spray into his face. Peter looked away to the dark, churning waves. His confidence shattered. The water beneath him softened, turning liquid and cold. He plunged downward. "Lord, save me!" Peter shouted. Before he could slip beneath, a hand gripped his wrist. The marketplace was a wall of noise and shifting bodies. Dust hung in the air, thick and dry, catching the late afternoon light. A woman pushed forward, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. For 12 years, her body had been a cage of constant, draining pain. She had exhausted every resource, sold everything she owned, and sought every healer, only to find the ache deepening with each passing season. Now, she was just another shadow in the press of the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on the center of the throng, where the movement of the people seemed to swirl around a single point. She knew the stories. She knew the rumors of what happened when he walked by. Her legs burned, and her head swam with the effort of staying upright. But she did not stop. She moved sideways, squeezing between shoulders and backs, ignoring the sharp elbows and the impatient shoves of those around her. The heat was stifling, a heavy weight that pressed down on her chest. She stumbled, caught herself on a wooden stall, and pushed off again. Her goal was not to speak, not to shout, not to be seen. It was only to be close enough. She saw the path clear slightly ahead. She lunged forward, her fingers trembling, reaching out toward the space where the hem of the passing figure would pass. Her last shred of hope hung on the distance of a single, desperate inch. Her hand lunged, fingers splayed, and brushed the fabric. It was a simple, coarse texture, but the moment her skin made contact, everything changed. A jolt, like a sudden intake of electricity, surged from her fingertips and raced through her arm, flooding her chest and legs. The persistent gnawing ache that had been her constant companion for 12 years vanished in a single sharp heartbeat. The heaviness in her joints dissolved. The weakness that had kept her tethered to the ground evaporated, replaced by a sudden, surging strength. She pulled her hand back, trembling, and looked down at her own limbs. They were steady. The tremors were gone. The exhaustion that usually clouded her vision lifted, and she stood upright, her spine straight, her breath coming deep and clear. She did not fall. She did not stumble. She felt the ground beneath her feet with a new, firm certainty. The crowd continued to press around her, oblivious, but she stood still, anchored by the reality of her own body. The pain was not just managed, it was erased. She took a step, then another, moving with a fluid, effortless grace she had not known in over a decade. She looked up, her gaze searching for the figure who had moved past her, but the power remained, a quiet, humming warmth inside her. The path ahead was quiet, the dust settling in the wake of the crowd. A man approached from the opposite direction, his gait uneven, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. He stopped before Jesus, his hands pressed against his knees, sweat carving tracks through the grime on his face. He did not speak at first, only looked up, his eyes wide with the weight of the news he carried. He spoke the name, Lazarus. He told of the fever that had seized the man, the rapid decline, and the final, heavy silence that had fallen over the house in Bethany. The news hung in the air, thick and unyielding. Jesus listened, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the lines of his face hardening. The disciples gathered close, their faces tightening as the reality of the report took hold. They turned their steps toward the road leading back to Judea. The journey was long, marked by the steady, rhythmic crunch of boots on dry earth. In the absence of the usual conversation, every mile felt heavier than the last. When they finally crested the hill, the air felt still. The path ended at a jagged limestone cliffside. A heavy circular stone sat embedded in the rock, sealing the entrance to the cave. It had been 4 days. The heat of the sun beat down on the dry, cracked ground, but the air near the tomb remained unnaturally still. Martha and Mary stood a few paces back, their eyes rimmed with red, their hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. They did not move. They did not speak. The silence of the place was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the ears. A faint, sickly odor drifted from the crevices around the stone, a sharp reminder of the time that had passed. The sisters' breathing was shallow and uneven, their shoulders hunched as if bearing a physical load. They had waited, watched, and finally surrendered. The disciples held back, their boots crunching softly on the loose gravel, but they stopped well short of the entrance. The tomb was a dark, unyielding void. It was a finality, a boundary that had been crossed. The shadows stretched long, waiting for a sound. Jesus walked the final few paces toward the cave. He stopped. The distance between him and the stone was less than an arm's length. He did not look at the disciples or the sisters. His gaze remained fixed on the rough, uneven surface of the rock that sealed the dark interior. His shoulders, previously set with purpose, began to tremble. A sharp, ragged sound broke the silence, a sob that tore through the stillness. He pressed his hands against his face, and the air around him seemed to contract. The onlookers stepped back, the sound of their shifting feet, the only noise. They watched, stunned, as the man who had commanded storms and healed the broken now stood shattered by the reality of the grave. Tears tracked through the dust on his cheeks, falling onto the parched earth. He did not try to hide the shaking of his frame or the depth of his sorrow. It was a visceral, heavy grief that anchored him to the ground. Then, the trembling ceased. He drew a long, steadying breath, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and stood tall. He turned his attention fully to the stone, his presence radiating a sudden, absolute focus. Jesus reached out, his hand hovering just inches from the rough, sun-baked surface of the stone. He did not look back at the crowd, but his voice carried clearly across the clearing. "Roll the stone away." The command was simple, yet it struck the air with the force of a physical blow. The men standing near the entrance did not move. They looked at the heavy rock, then at the dark, narrow gap between it and the cliffside. Martha stepped forward, her hands raised in a frantic, defensive gesture. She shook her head, her face pale, her voice tight with a mixture of grief and dread. "Lord, it has been 4 days. The air inside, there will be a stench." Jesus did not lower his hand. He turned to her, his expression unyielding, his eyes reflecting a certainty that defied the logic of the grave. He looked back at the men, his gaze commanding, leaving no room for hesitation. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The men shifted, their boots scraping against the loose gravel. They gripped the edges of the stone, muscles straining, knuckles whitening under the pressure. The rock groaned. The stone hit the dirt with a final jarring thud, leaving the tomb entrance gaping wide. A cold, heavy draft rolled out from the dark interior, carrying the stale, stagnant air of the grave. The crowd surged backward, a collective gasp rippling through the people as they turned their faces away. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to swallow the very sound of the wind. Jesus did not recoil. He stepped forward until his shadow fell across the threshold, reaching deep into the blackness of the cave. The air around him grew dense, charged with a sudden, electric stillness. He drew a breath, his chest expanding. Then, he opened his mouth. His voice resonated, vibrating through the ground. "Lazarus, come out!" The words hung in the air. Every eye was fixed on the dark, empty mouth of the tomb, waiting for the impossible. The silence held for a heartbeat, then another. Then, from the deepest reaches of the tomb, a sound broke the stillness, the faint, dry scrape of fabric against stone. The crowd surged forward, then stopped dead, paralyzed by what they saw. A shape emerged from the gloom. It moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, swaying as it crossed the threshold into the blinding light of day. The figure was bound from head to foot in strips of linen, the bindings tight and layered, restricting every movement. It was a man, yet he carried the unmistakable silence of the grave. He took another step, his feet shuffling over the loose dirt, the grave wrappings rustling with every labored motion. The onlookers fell back, their breath hitching in their throats, eyes wide and fixed on the impossible sight. The man did not stop. He reached the edge of the tomb, his head tilted as if listening to a sound only he could hear. He stood there, a living testament to a power that defied the finality of death. Lazarus was alive. The terror that had gripped the crowd dissolved into a profound, trembling awe. Death had not just been challenged, it had been forced to yield. The dust settled, but the silence remained. It was no longer the silence of shock, but of something deeper, a weight pressing down on the minds of everyone gathered. They looked at the man who had been dead, then at the one who had spoken the command. These were not the movements of a magician or the clever illusions of a performer. There were no hidden wires, no sleight of hand, no trickery to explain the impossible. The bread had multiplied in their hands. The storm had bowed to a single word, and now the grave had surrendered its prisoner. Each event stood as a stark, undeniable marker in the landscape of their lives. They were signs, pointing toward a reality that existed far beyond the reach of human logic or scientific explanation. They were declarations, spoken in the language of action, that the laws governing the physical world were subject to a higher authority. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was impossible when the source of life intervened. The people watched, their eyes tracing the path from the empty tomb to the figure standing before them, finally grasping the truth. The miracles were not the end, they were the threshold. Every healing, every calming of the sea, and every return from the darkness served one purpose: to prove that the impossible was simply a matter of God's will. The ancient hills of Galilee have long since quieted, and the dusty roads where he walked have been paved over by the march of centuries. Yet, the echoes of those events did not fade into the silence of history. They traveled. They crossed the vast, invisible divide between that world and this one. The same hand that stilled the storm on the Sea of Galilee is not a relic of the past, locked behind the glass of ancient scrolls. It remains a present, active force. Look at the world today, the same sickness, the same despair, the same impossible walls that people face in their own lives. The narrative did not end at the tomb of Lazarus. It continued, unfolding in every corner of the globe where someone reaches out for help. This is not a story of what once was. It is a report on what still is. The compassion that moved him to stop for a blind man by the roadside is the same compassion that moves through the world this very hour. The power that broke the grip of death is not diminished by the passage of time. It is a constant, a baseline reality that operates beneath the surface of the mundane. The laws of nature that yielded to his voice then are still subject to his authority now. The miracle is not a distant memory. It is a current, waiting to be tapped. You stand before your own set of locked doors. Perhaps it is a sickness that refuses to yield, a debt that grows with every passing month, or a path that has vanished into the thicket of uncertainty. You have heard the accounts of the blind man, the storm, and the empty tomb, but they feel like distant echoes. You wonder if that same power has any reach into your living room, your office, or the quiet desperation of your midnight hours. Stop looking for the miracle in the pages of a book. Look at the space between where you are and where you need to be. The same force that broke the grip of death on Lazarus is not a historical artifact. It is a current flowing through the very air you breathe. It is not waiting for a specific time or a perfect set of circumstances. It is pressing against the boundaries of your current reality. You do not need to cross an ocean or wait for a sign in the sky. The distance is shorter than a single breath. The story does not stop here. It does not pause, and it does not fade. It is a living, breathing reality that continues to move through the world. You have heard the accounts of the blind man, the storm, and the empty tomb. You have seen the logic of the world overturned by a single command. Now, the focus shifts to you. This is not a conclusion, it is a beginning. The same authority that spoke to the waves and the dead is present in your current reality. It is not a distant force, but an active, pressing influence. You are standing at the edge of your own impossible. The question is no longer whether the power exists, but whether you are ready to witness it. Stop waiting for the world to change its laws. Start looking for the moment the laws of your own life begin to bend. The miracle is not a distant event on a calendar. It is a present, unfolding truth. It is the shift in the air when the impossible gives way. It is the moment you stop measuring the odds and start recognizing the authority that stands beside you. The path is open. The invitation is clear. Step forward and watch as the impossible becomes your new, undeniable reality. The miracle is here. It is waiting for you to see it.